Bonang Mohale, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You just gave a talk here about business in South Africa. Maybe you can just recap very briefly what it was that you were discussing.
Because we are talking about nation building, I thought that I should start by where would we be had we continued on the trajectory of Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela's dreams.
Right.
I made the point that he inherited a technically bankrupt country on the 27th of April 1994. But in just 5 years, he increased the GDP, the growth of this country, 2.5 times.
Okay.
And therefore, the trajectory was upwards and forwards. He then hands over seamlessly in a world-class act to Thabo Mbeki, who then continues on that trajectory.
Right.
Who goes on to give us 43 consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth.
Wow.
At that time, we get 500,000 families into the middle class. We increase the number of university students from 7% to 11%.
Right.
At that time, we then say, what would have happened had we just continued on that trajectory?
Right.
Then I make 3 points and say, one, had we continued, our debt to GDP ratio would not be sitting at 63%, excluding guarantees to SOCs and SOCs, but at 43%.
Yeah, SOCs being state-owned companies, right?
Exactly, and
Yeah.
state-owned enterprises. Number
Yeah.
two, that unemployment would be 16%, not 29% that we're on now. That number three.
How do you come to that figure?
So you simply you calculate the area under the graph.
Yeah.
And say growth,
Yeah.
and you say, had we just, it's an extrapolation.
So are you extrapolating growth at 4% or 5% per year in over the last decade, basically? To
In
come
fact,
to those
the
figures?
last decade at a conservative 1% positive GDP growth, just 1%.
Just 1%.
Yes. Remember, in 2007, in December, we touched 5.4% GDP growth.
Yeah.
And that was the last time we touched that. And then the other number I shared with them, I said, yes, unemployment will be 16%. GDP would be 6%, not 0.8%. And then lastly, would have banked 1 trillion South African rands. And then I went on to say, now that we have had a look at this, but what's wrong with the structure of the South African economy? And we said, look, there's now 58.78 million of us, and 51% of that is female. 60%, it's actually 56%, is people who are 35 years and younger.
Right.
That unemployment is exactly the same population as the population of Gauteng at 10 million.
Right.
People that are not gainfully employed, using the narrow ILO definition. When you consider that is the same population as Gauteng, I then went on to make the point to say, actually, Gauteng contributes 35% to the national GDP.
Yeah.
So you've just taken those people out.
Yeah.
Followed by KwaZulu-Natal at 16 and Western Cape at 14% contribution to the country. I then ended up by saying, what can business do now that 6 million young children don't know their fathers? That only 14% go to a home where there's a both mom and a dad.
How much? 14%?
Only 14% go
Of
to
South
a
African
household.
families?
Yes, go
Of
to a
children?
household where there's both mom and a dad. The
Right.
majority are single moms.
Yeah.
So you can see where our problems stand from.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I then say, what can business do? Because government can't do it, it's out of money. Labor cannot do it because 2 million is almost half the size. And the majority of union members are now public servants, not private sector. The average age is now 45 years, which means there's no cross-subsidization. In 20 years, there will be no
Sorry, I
new
don't quite
members.
understand that point. The average trade union is a public servant
Yes,
at 45 years
the
old?
majority of union members today work for government, not for the private sector.
How do you say that? You mean because of the relationship between the ANC and COSATU?
No, the absolute numbers, just in absolute numbers. Remember, COSATU used to have 2 million members.
Yeah. I see what you meant.
And then NUMSA pulled out with about 800,000.
Right.
So the private sector employs 13.5 million people.
Yeah.
Totality of government, 3 spheres, 2.3 million, directly 1.3 million. So when you look at absolute numbers of union members, the majority of them are now in the public sector, not in the private
But
sector.
now let's just talk about the business sector and how that can help in turning around this trajectory, this declining trajectory.
So I advanced and submitted 6 big burning platform issues on which business can lead not to follow.
Yeah.
Number one, I said business must lead on land reform, not just expropriation without compensation.
Right.
Because our constitution adequately caters for land expropriation without compensation in section 25.
So we don't need a change in the law?
Nothing at all.
Okay.
Nothing at all. Section 25, Article 3A, and I said, in there it says when conditions of fair and equitable have been adequately fulfilled, compensation can be down to zero. There it is. So here it's a failure of implementation, not inadequacy of policy.
Yeah.
It was General George Patton who said, great wars are won by good execution, not great plans. Because good execution will save even a mediocre plan. So
but has this not become a very emotionally fraught issue in South Africa?
Of course it's emotional. Of course it is. It is. But we had no business to do it because it is adequately catered for. But
so the law allows for it already. So why is this being discussed? Why do we need a change in the constitution?
Because the ANC-led government in the past 25 years have been lazy and they were not focusing on it. And I said land reform, not expropriation without compensation. Because land reform, there are three issues. There's restitution, there's redistribution, and land development. Right. Secondly, I said business must lead on transformation. This economy must be broadly reflective of the demographics.
So how can business get involved in this land reform issue, do you think?
Most of parcels of land are actually owned by business, by mines, prospecting, and they're not doing anything. Yeah. So some of those can say, government, here's a parcel of land, build RDP houses. There's parcels of land, do farming. Business can say, you know what, we know how to do wine farming, let's take a community and teach them how. They can lead. Secondly, I said they must lead in transformation. Because imagine when business is transformed, the whole of South Africa will be transformed. Because business employs 13.5 million people, government 2.3 million. This economy must be broadly reflective of the demographics. 51% of the population is female, and yet female representation in positions of leadership is less than 24%.
All right. One of the problems that you have in South Africa is that money is leaving the country. There's a flight of capital out of the country at the moment, and that is reflective of loss of confidence in the governance in South Africa. You have the Zondo Commission, and for people who are listening here, the Zondo Commission in South Africa is really looking at this issue called state capture and corruption between the private sector and the public sector. And it's been horrifying for a lot of South Africans and a lot of people overseas to see the extent to which capture has been going on in this country. That would explain to some extent why capital is fleeing the country. What, in your opinion, is needed to reverse that? I mean, what's going to restore confidence?
So first of all, the lack of confidence is self-made, self-inflicted, self-harm. This year alone, 350,000 families have emigrated. For the first time in the history of this country, a majority of them are black professionals. Yeah. When you ask South Africans what keeps you awake at night, they're saying crime and personal safety.
Yeah.
For your children, you'll do whatever it takes.
And we have the xenophobic attacks which have happened in the last few days as well. And the whole world is watching this.
It exacerbates an already a dire situation.
Yeah.
So let me just continue on where business must lead in answering this question. The third, we said business must lead in taking us out of this fiscal crisis. Because only business can. It has disproportionate resources, a disproportionate voice.
Yeah.
Because when business does well, society generally does well. Business cannot continue to be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty.
Right.
It's in business's self-enlightened interest to make sure that South Africa exists. The last three, I said business must lead in ensuring that we keep the few jobs that we have so that over a period of time we can create jobs in large numbers. There are 18 million people on social security, only 16 million gainfully employed. The math doesn't add up.
No.
Only 7.2 million are registered for tax with SARS.
Yeah.
And 83% of all the taxes that SARS collects every year comes from only 2.3 million South Africans.
Yeah.
Put another way, only 105,000 South Africans earn 1.5 million and above as taxpayers. So we can see that it's not sustainable. Therefore, business must lead. The last two, I said, business needs to lead in ensuring that this economy grows.
Yeah.
Because if the economy is not growing, very soon we'll be talking about the redistribution of poverty, not the redistribution of wealth. The last one, I said business must lead in taking this notion called education much more seriously. We must grow our own timber. We are the only country in Africa, 1.3 billion people, 54 countries that speak 2,000 languages, that became free from our colonial masters, and yet we did not intentionally improve the quality of our education. 1957, Ghana becomes free. 10 years later, Kwame Nkrumah boasts of an 80% literacy rate. Gabriel Robert Mugabe, in spite of all the challenges that country is confronted with, 12 million people, 5 million of them outside of Zimbabwe, they are boasting of 94% literacy rate today.
Yeah.
What do we have to boast with as South Africans?
Yeah.
The last FAIR study says 80% of grade 4 learners cannot read with comprehension.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course it's well known in this country that the Zimbabwe education system is miles ahead of what we got in South Africa.
Because it's Cambridge standards.
What has happened in Zimbabwe? I went to school in Zimbabwe. I went a couple of weeks ago to the school where I attended, and they have these placards. All the alumni who went through that, but they're all overseas. Guys who became nuclear scientists, and they're developing race cars and that kind of thing. That's what's happening in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Is the talent? You just said it. 350,000 people left South Africa
this
last
year
year.
alone.
This year.
Alone, and it's not even
finished. And they're the professional class.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
So let me conclude by saying, Africans in the continent have learned 3 things. Number one, that the Uhuru presidents that stay for 40 years like Mugabe are not good for Africans.
Yeah. Yeah.
Number two, they've learned that even the good guys left on their own eventually become the bad guys.
Yeah.
3, they've learned that a vibrant opposition is a good thing for democracy to keep the good guys in check.
Is your message getting across to government? Are you engaging with them?
We are, in fact, at the highest level.
Right.
This is the most business-friendly president we've ever had.
Right.
Since he took over on the 19th of December 2017 as the president of the ANC, he changed the boards of ESCOM, of SAA and DINEL.
Yeah.
When he became inaugurated, after the best Valentine present we ever received, when the sitting president stepped down, he was inaugurated on the 15th of February. He's ensured that he really invites business leadership South Africa on all the state visits. He has never hosted a head of state as Fako Mahato Presidential Guest House without inviting us. And he's a listening, receptive president.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the internal science strife within the ANC has tied both his hands and the feet behind his back.
Yeah.
And therefore he feels constrained. I don't know where that feeling comes from, because he won a decisive victory at 57% from the majority of South Africans.
Right. What's your opinion about Tito Mboweni? Tito Mboweni is the South African finance minister. He issued a plan for rebooting the South African economy a week ago. What's your opinion on that?
It's about time, because you can't lead by committee. He's consulted to an extent that it is necessary to consult. Then he issues a paper for public comment and input.
Yeah.
You see, the beauty about plans is that it's not that they are perfect. It's not that they are comprehensive.
Yeah.
The trick is to start.
Yeah.
And then fine-tune and tweak as you go along. There is no perfect plan. Therefore, I think he's saying, let me get your input so that we can focus on 4, no more than 5 things in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, so that at least we can really pull ourselves by our own bootstraps.
Yes, and
because
I like the fact that he had tourism there, because tourism can create 2 million jobs in 10 years on its own. Tourism.
Today, tourism
by relaxing visa requirements,
exactly.
Our infrastructure is good, it's world class.
Yes.
The only thing is, we have this, we shoot ourselves in the foot, right?
Exactly.
You just, what's been happening on the streets of South Africa and Joburg, it's not going to attract tourists right now. We got to
tourism is important to us, and it's a low-hanging fruit. Let me just say 3 things about tourism, and then I leave you so that I don't detain you until long. Number one, it used to today it contributes 9% of the GDP. There's no reason why it can't be 20. Number two, we are the only country in the world that can say to tourists and potential tourists, whatever you need, South Africa has it. The only country. Lastly, for every 8 tourists that come to South Africa, we create 1 permanent job. In Canada, it's 1 for 1. University graduates learn about Toronto, they learn about Banff, they learn about Whistler, and then they go out and tell tourists. From the tips alone, they make on average 3,500 Canadian dollars a month. Therefore, we don't even have to invest anything. It's really low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
If we focus on it, we have blue skies, African sunshine. We've got the big 5. We've got 2 oceans.
And we've got capacity. There's only 60% occupancy in the hotels in South Africa, so it doesn't need more hotels.
You've been a gentleman and a scholar. And
thank you so much, Bonang.